Okay. Okay, so we're going to do two chapters tonight, I think. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 had like 12 or 13 verses. It's very short. So we're going to go into chapter 9 also. And this is our blog where you can go and listen to recordings of some of the Bible studies that that you missed, or you can see our prayer request list, which is on here. And you can also go to the place where you can click on and join our fellowship without having to wait on the email or having to worry about me being late with the email. Paul continues to answer the questions that were sent to him in a letter, or more than one letter, most likely. And he begins this chapter and he says, now, after all the stuff that we dealt with last week, he says, now, and he addresses their questions about eating meat sacrificed to idols. That's a big part of tonight's discussion. Now, Corinth was thoroughly permeated by idolatry and pagan practices. So it was probably difficult to even find meat that had not been sacrificed to an idol or used in a sacrifice. I'll explain that to you in a minute. There were at least 16 temples and shrines in Corinth, all pagan, of course, many of which served meat, served food. So the meat offered on the pagan altar was divided into three different types. One part, or three different parts. One part was burned as a sacrifice. It wasn't used. Another part was given to the priest, to the pagan priests. The third part was given to the person giving the offering. So either the priest or the one giving the offering, or both, would occasionally take the meat to the market to be sold. Let's say that they had done sacrifices, 2 nights before, and they still had meat left over. So when they were given the meat from tonight's sacrifice or this afternoon's sacrifice, they would take it down to the market and they would sell it. So you never knew whether the meat that you were buying at the market had been sacrificed or not. So it was important to cover this subject. So Paul begins with saying, now, look, talking about things offered to idols. And I'm not giving the whole verse here. I'm going to come back to it in a minute. The subject of meat sacrificed to idols was addressed by the Jerusalem Conference, if you remember back in Acts 15. And we studied that when we went through Acts. And here is part of what they said. Said, but we write to them, it's talking about them being Gentiles, that they abstain from pollutions of idols, from worshiping idols, from fornication, from sex outside of marriage, and from things strangled, things that died on their own is mostly what that means, and from blood. Don't drink blood. And we know that some of these things were covered in the law when Moses wrote the first 5 books of the law. So then in verse 29, he continues and he says that you abstain from meats offered to idols, from blood, this is from the Jerusalem Conference, and from things strangled, and from fornication, from which if you keep yourselves, you shall do well. Fare you well. So these are some of the things that the Jerusalem Conference made a determination on Gentile Christians. Now, here's something that you have to take into consideration here. While they're not as succinct as I'm about to be when I say this. What they basically were saying is, hey, stay out of the temples. Nothing good's going to happen when you go in that temple. They were worshiping idols. They were having sex with the, not everybody, obviously, but people had sex with the temple prostitutes. They ate food that was unclean. Maybe it was a clean animal, but it had not been bled. It had died on, what we call roadkill, and from drinking blood. So basically what the Jerusalem conference was saying was, stay out of the temples. They're not good for you. Only bad things are going to happen. And that's the way I look at what came about as in the Jerusalem conference of Acts 15. So here's all of verse 1. He says, now as touching things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. And knowledge puffs up, but love edifies, builds. Okay, knowledge is not always a good thing. It's good to have knowledge, but you also need to have some wisdom to go along with it, or else you can go down the wrong road with knowledge. And we know that, particularly in Athens and Corinth, we know they did go down the wrong road, because those two cities were the center of intelligence. And boy, they believed it too. They were puffed up. So now the Greek word that was translated things offered to idols is a single word, idolotheton. And you can hear the word idol in that word. It's the same word that was used in Acts 15 when the Jerusalem conference declared that the Gentiles would refrain from these things. At that time, at the Jerusalem conference, two of the main speakers were Paul and Barnabas. Where had Paul and Barnabas been prior to the Jerusalem conference? And I'm not going to spend all night long on Acts 15, but where had they been? They had been over to the area of Galatia, where they had seen what was going on in the temples. And so they came back to Jerusalem. They were asked to come back. They were asked to come back and speak. And they said, here's the deal. The problem is in the temples. We need to keep Christians out of the temples. Anyway, that's my interpretation of it. I'm sticking to it. And as I say, I might be wrong, but I'm not confused. Okay, so the potential Gentile converts were continuing to attend the pagan temples where all these things were occurring, and they were told, we don't want you to do that. Okay, so now let's bounce back to Corinth. As I said, it was nearly impossible or very difficult to know whether the meat you were buying at the market had where it came from. So it was logical that the Corinthians would ask Paul, hey, Paul, what do we do about this? And so based on Paul's reply, he seems to have felt that there was some self-righteousness implied in their question. And maybe their question was phrased this way, and I'm playing on words here. I've got a little game I'm going to play. Dear Paul, the question keeps coming up in services whether we should abstain from eating certain meats. We know it's just meat, but some of our new members seem to be having a problem with it. Do we really have to be concerned about how they feel about us eating meat that may have been sacrificed to an idol? Now, I've made that up, but I can really see this as part of the conversation that was going on in this letter. We don't know, but I can't help but think, maybe this was the approach that they were taking. So now, to carry on my little game here, Paul replies, we know that we all have knowledge. But the problem with knowledge is that sometimes it creates an attitude of arrogance. On the other hand, love builds up. A little courtesy goes a long way. So anyway, that's a little game that I played, as if I were there, and I wasn't, and I can't prove anything that I just said. It's just one other way to look at it. So now Paul continues down in verse 2. He says, if any man thinks that he knows anything, or in other words, if a man thinks he knows, he's a know-it-all, he doesn't know anything as what he ought to know. So, hey, you people aren't nearly as smart as you think you are. Yes, meat is meat. Whether it's been in a pagan temple doesn't really change that, does it? It's still meat. But you need to show love, and you need to be thoughtful toward people who are having a problem with it. If somebody has a real problem with eating or seeing someone eat meat sacrificed to idols, guess what? Don't do it. It's pretty simple. It's really, really simple. Don't put a stumbling block in front of a child. And by child, I'm talking about someone that's new in the faith. Starting in verse 3, he goes through 3 through 7 here. But if any man loves God, if you really love God, God knows you. And as concerning the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice to idols, we know an idol is nothing, doesn't exist. It's not a God. There's only one God. For though there are those that are called gods, now remember we're in Corinth, in the area of Athens, where there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little g gods. Michael has talked about how there's like 3 million gods in India. That just blows me away. So he says there are a lot of things that are called gods, whether in heaven or in earth, as there be gods many and lords many. But to us, there's only one God. One God the Father, of whom are all things, we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things. He created everything. God sent Christ to do the creation, and he did it. And we exist because of Christ. And then he goes on in verse 7, he says, however, there's not in every man that knowledge. Everybody's not that strong to not worry about whether some meat was sacrificed to idols. For some with conscience, some that are worried about it, of the idol to this hour, they eat it as a thing offered to an idol. So it bothers them. And their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Paul is saying, look, we know there's only one God, but some of them don't know this. The little gods, the little g gods, some of them still believe in are nothing. They don't even exist, but they exist in these people's minds. But we need to consider their feelings. We don't need to put a stumbling block in front of them. We need to be gentle with little ones in the faith, who, when they see you eating meat that may have been sacrificed to an idol, they have a crisis of conscience. It bothers them. Doesn't bother us, wouldn't bother me at all, I don't think, to eat meat that had been sacrificed to an idol if it was clean meat. But I've never come across that I know of. So, I don't know whether it would or not, but I don't think it would bother me. And in verse 8, he goes on, but meat does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we better, or if we don't eat are we worse. It's just food. But take heed lest by any means this freedom of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. I think this is so clear what Paul is saying. Saying, hey, there's not a thing in the world wrong with eating meat sacrificed to an idol if it doesn't bother you, but don't do it if it bothers somebody else and they see you eat it. It's pretty simple. You know, and this is a principle that we can use concerning all kinds of different things. The key is don't put a stumbling block in front of a little one. So Paul comes back to his point about love being the most important thing. Neither eating or not eating meat that may have been sacrificed to an idol is not important unless it causes someone to stumble. Anybody got anything to add or correct or take away on that one? I think it's pretty clear.
Hey, Skip.
Yeah, Blake, Mr. Silverstein.
Thank you. There's a really easy way around all this. You've heard of gluten-free. You just got to go to the butcher and say, I want idol-free meat. Just tell them. They'll give you idol-free meat every time.
That's a great point. And remember that principle during the days of unleavened bread when you're in a restaurant. Does this have leaven in it? Do you want it to?
Kidding aside, though, I think a lot of times some people, I've come across some people who are really worried and concerned about, this is a little bit different, but are very worried about pork products and things that are maybe used in a a good example is these gelatin caps that are used for vitamins. They can use the gelatin that's made from pig's hooves, and some people find that to be unclean. I feel like you can almost make an argument here that I saw a long presentation. I'm sorry if I'm going on too long here, but a long presentation on how there's so many refined and processed products that we come into contact with that contain unclean, quote unquote, products in them, that it's almost impossible to not come into contact with these things. And so, I just think that there is something in here where, you can probably argue with people that have gone off the deep end and becoming too concerned and too worried about some of those things, and kind of missing the point. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, another good example is a restaurant that cooks on griddles, not girdles, griddles. And they fry bacon and then they cook your eggs on the same griddle. Now they clean them off.
Yeah.
But you can, and I think that's kind of like, I think this is a little bit about what Paul is saying. Your example may be a little more extreme. I know that, for instance, and I know Barb and I've talked about this, there are some natural pills that help you with your arthritis and bone density and all that kind of stuff. And some of it is made from shark bones.
Okay, yeah.
And so, do you take those pills or do you not? And it's an individual decision on that one. So anyway, I won't go into that. We can spend the rest of the week on this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Skip?
Yeah, Jim.
Another good example would be, like if I had the same problem as my dad and had a heart valve replaced, quite often they replace it with a pig valve.
Yep.
They did in his case. Now, he didn't need a pig, and that valve works because the pig's valves are very much like ours.
Yeah, a lady I went to church with one time made a comment that she would rather die than have a pig's valve put in her. And, that's her call. We're free. So anyway, let's go out. Like I say, we could be all week on this, and I'm sure there's lots of different opinions out there. Some of you aren't saying anything. Okay. Does anybody else want to say anything that hadn't been covered? Okay. So he continues in verse 10. You know, he's on the same stream of consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. He's still covering this same thing. He says, if any man sees you which has knowledge, okay, you know where you are. You know you're in the temple, and they see you eating a meal, eating meat in the idol's temple. Shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols, which could mess that person up? Oh, I don't have to obey any of God's laws because Paul was in this temple. Paul wouldn't have been, but you know what I'm saying. So-and-so was in the temple eating a hamburger. And so now I can do anything I want. I don't have to worry about it. Paul seems to be saying here that someone who knows that the god or the idol is nothing may actually go into a pagan temple to eat. For some reason, you know, this is just an analogy, wherever it is. I can't help but wonder if it's more of a metaphor than an actuality right here. You know, maybe it did happen, but it may just be a metaphor. So his point is that we need to be careful in the actions we take because our actions could lead to someone sinning. And we've already covered this. It's almost getting redundant here. Verse 11, and through your knowledge, and this is the knowledge that he just spoke of, that, you know, the guy knew he was in the temple, or whatever this metaphor is. And through your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. Is this person going to give up their faith? Speaking of which, by the way, I want to give a little plug here to Mike James. Beginning tomorrow night, Mike is going to be covering a course in the, I don't know if they're calling it a college or what, but CFN, and he's going to be covering a course. There's a book called God's Problem, and it's written by a man who did lose his faith, and is no longer a Christian because of all of the suffering that he saw in the world. So that's all. Mike, do you want to throw anything in here? I wanted to give you a plug.
Oh, thanks, Skip. Yeah, so that course will be run during the year, next year also. This is the first running. So if anybody's interested in it, just shoot me an email. I'll let you know when we run it again next year. And we'll probably be adding more courses in the future. Thanks, Skip.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing it. I think it'll be fun. Okay. So Paul goes on and he says, you know, look, you knew better. And because you know better, shall the weak brother perish? Shall they give? Okay, Mike says it's possible Christians may have been invited to pagan temples for special events. Exactly. Thanks for adding that. It's my understanding that a lot of the apparently there were rooms in the pagan temples for this. Yeah, there were meetings. There were unions, if you will, back then, and they had union meetings in these temples. Thanks, Mike, for adding that. I'd forgotten all about that. He says, but when you mess up, when you so blatantly do this, and it causes a brother to lose his faith, you wound their conscience, you're the one that's sinning against Christ. Wherefore, if meat sacrificed to idols, makes my brother to offend, and whatever the subject is, you know, this is a great metaphor for anything we might do that technically is probably harmless, but it causes someone else problems. We need to avoid those things. Wherefore, if meat makes my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world stays. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to offend my brother. And there again, I'm telling you, this is a metaphor. And he's talking about meat, but it's a metaphor for anything, lest I make my brother to offend, or lest I offend my brother. Now, that was the end. I told you it was short. That was the end of chapter 8. Anybody want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, Skip, two things that I've noticed over the years. I mean, this goes back a long time, but it occurs occasionally to relate it to our world today is one, the use of alcohol with those that don't believe in using it or feel difficult with it. And then secondly, people that might come into the faith and be vegetarians and or just be a vegetarian and, not want to eat meat. I've seen it time and time again where people, take their liberty to offend somebody, and it creates problems within a congregation.
Those are two good examples. Thanks. Yeah. And those are, that's the metaphor part. Hank says in chapter 8 reminds him the need on our part. I missed it, Hank. Let me go back here. Or Michael, can you, or somebody, you want to read the chat?
Of who? Mike James?
No, Hank, Henry.
I don't have a chat from Henry. He must have sent it to you privately.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, let me go check. That won't take but just a second. Yeah, he did. He says chapter 8 reminds him of the need on our part as Christians to obey both the letter and the spirit of the law. Yeah, I'm, as you all know, I'm real big on the spirit of the law. Not that the letter's not important, but I think that the spirit of the law is more important because, as in this case, the letter of the law is don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. But the spirit of the law is don't do anything that's going to offend your brother. So you do both. Well, maybe a bad example because I don't think it's wrong to eat meat sacrificed to idols. But anyway, okay. So now, beginning in chapter 9, of course, this letter was not written in chapters. It was broken into chapters by the translators. But Paul, in saying what he just got through saying, yeah, Hank, he's saying, look, I have a little authority to say this stuff. I'm not just John Smith off the street, a brand new Christian. I've been a Christian for 3 days. Paul's saying, look, I'm an apostle, but I'm free. I've seen Jesus Christ, which brings up an interesting thing. Where did he see Jesus Christ? Did he see Jesus Christ before he died? Did he see him while he was on the cross? Or is he talking about when he saw him when he was down in Damascus? Or all three? We don't know. We do know that Paul was standing there when Stephen was murdered. So Paul did see some stuff. So he is an apostle. He has seen Christ. He is free. But yet he's a doulos. A doulos is a slave. We are slaves to Christ. We're willing slaves to Christ, but at the same time, we're free. He says, are you not my work in the Lord? He's talking to the church, people in the church in Corinth. I've been here. I've worked with you all. I've taught you about Christ. I've taught you about the gospel. I'm an apostle. I have the authority to speak here. And you're my workmanship. And, he doesn't say it right here, but I'm proud to call you my work. Okay. The y'all have heard me quote the preacher's outline in Study Bible. I think it's Study Bible. Anyway, it has this to say about chapter 9, verse 1. Paul was a true minister of God. I don't think any of us doubt that at all. In fact, he was an apostle, one of the few who had actually seen the Lord Jesus Christ. However, there were those in the Corinthian church who didn't like Paul. And you can tell by the letter that they wrote based on Paul's responses, you can tell some of them didn't like him. Therefore, they set out to get rid of Paul and to destroy his ministry. So now in chapter 9, he starts to defend himself. Paul didn't have to defend himself. But there were some in that church that needed to hear this. Paul didn't care. Well, I don't know if it was he didn't care, but it was not the end of the world to Paul if somebody didn't respect him. He was so used to that. Goodness gracious, look at all the things that had happened to him. So apparently these people attempted to turn the whole Corinthian church against Paul. So Paul is having to start to defend himself. So in verse 1, he states that he's an apostle. And part of the proof is that he saw the resurrected Christ. Well, didn't say the resurrected Christ. He saw Christ. I think he saw the resurrected Christ. Now, if you remember when Stephen and Matthias were chosen when Matthias was chosen to replace Judas, the requirement mentioned for being an apostle was that you had to be a witness of the resurrected Christ. So based on that requirement, I would say it's pretty clear that Paul did see the resurrected Christ. Now in Acts 1:21, my clicker's not working. Here we go. This is talking about apostles. Wherefore of these men which have accompanied with us all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John to that same day when he was taken up into the heavens, must one be ordained to be a witness with us of his resurrection. So this is one of the requirements of being an apostle. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and that he was buried, Christ was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures. And he was seen by Peter, then of the 12. After that, he was seen of about 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part are still alive, but some of them have died. After that, he was seen by his brother James, his half-brother James. Then all the apostles saw him. And last of all, he was seen of me also, as of one born out of due time. Paul came along later. Paul was struck down on the road to Damascus 10 or 15 years later, if I remember right. I can't remember the actual date of his conversion. I've got it written down somewhere, but anyway. Paul said, all these people saw the resurrected Christ, and last of all, he was seen of me. I'm an apostle. I have the authority to teach, and I have taught, and you're my workmanship. Now, also in verse 1, I'll back up. He says, am I not free? Galatians 5. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and don't be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Anybody have an idea of what this yoke of slavery was that Paul is talking about here? I believe that what Paul is talking about here is that there was a vast idea that you had to observe the law perfectly in order to be saved. And that was a yoke of bondage, because no one, except Jesus Christ, no human can stand up to that scrutiny. We are saved through God's grace by our faith. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't need to obey God. It doesn't mean that we don't need to repent and so on. But that's how we're saved. Okay, thanks, Mike. James says that Paul's conversion was around 34 or 37 AD. So it was only 3 or 4 years after. And Mike said, yeah, the Jews thought that the law could save, that keeping the law could save you. Guess what? Ain't happening. Never has, never will. You can't be saved by observing the law. You can only be saved by the blood of Jesus Christ. Period. Anyway, I'm sorry. I know I've said that about 8,000 times in the last 2 or 3 years. Okay, verse 2 of chapter 9. He says, if I'm not an apostle to others, I am to you, because you're my workmanship. I've taught you all. I've been there. I've been to your church or churches. I've been in your midst. For the seal of my apostleship are you in the Lord. You're the proof that I'm an apostle. I think that's really neat. It's an interesting proof that Paul gives them of his authority, that it's the very people who are questioning his authority. Many of them have been led to the Lord by Paul. The fact that they were believers were proof of his calling and of his apostleship. Verse 3, he says, my defense to those who examine me is this. Now, we before I get into that, we can see in verse 3 that Paul's a little irritated that he's having to defend himself. And strangely, part of the reason that he's having to defend himself is because he refused to let the Corinthians pay his expenses. We'll get into that in a few minutes, or maybe next. He seemed to know that accepting payment from them could cause problems, or would cause problems. So ironically, not taking a salary from them created them to question his authority. It was one of those, excuse my language, damned if you do, judged if you do, judged if you don't. Whether Paul accepted money or didn't accept money, there were people that took either side or both sides. Oh, well, Paul, he couldn't be an apostle because he's being paid. They're paying him to say what they want him to say. You've heard that one before. Verse 4. This is right after he says, here's my defense. Don't we have the power to eat and drink? I'm a minister, and I've come to Corinth, and I go to these other places. Do we, he and Barnabas, and Silas may have been with him at the time, don't we have the power to eat and to drink? Now, I've got a problem with the word power, and I'll talk to you about it a little bit. The Greek word that was translated power is probably better translated authority. Don't we have the authority to eat and drink? The NASB says it this way. Do we not have a right to eat and drink? Here's what Expositor's commentary says. Paul now begins to defend himself against those who have criticized his apostleship on the grounds that he had not exercised all the rights that an apostle might exercise. This is ridiculous. So verse 5 now brings up an interesting subject that very little is said about this. In all my years in the church, I don't ever remember having a big discussion on this particular subject. It says, don't we have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Peter? The other apostles were apparently taking their wives on their missionary journeys or their journeys or whatever. And I think the point Paul's making is, you guys are paying their expenses, and you're paying the expenses of their wives. Don't we have the same authority? Or in verse 6, do only Barnabas and I not have this authority to refrain from working? This has really irritated Paul because he's not being treated like the other apostles. Now, it's not that bothered him. It's that he's catching all this flack from Corinth about this. Otherwise, Paul wouldn't have ever said a word about it. He didn't care. He made his own living. He made tents. Paul is saying that, these other apostles are taking their wives, maybe their sisters or others, to serve and take care of them, to cook their meals and things while they're out spreading the gospel. And there's nothing in the world wrong with that. And so Paul's a little irritated, and he said, why is it that Barnabas and I are the only ones that have to work to earn our keep? It was Paul's practice to earn his own keep by working as a tent maker. And then he carries this a little bit farther, goes in a little bit different direction. He says, hey, tell me, what soldier goes to war at his own expense? Who plants a field and doesn't eat the fruit of it? Who tends a flock and doesn't use the milk of the flock? He continues making the case that people who spend full time in the service of God should be paid for their work. In verse 8, he says, I'm not talking about these things according to human judgment. Doesn't the law talk about this? And it's a good thing that Diane is not in this room. She'd slap me upside the head because I've said this about 8,000 times because it's a perfect example. He says, for it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is working. You shall not mistreat your employees. You shall not mistreat a minister of the gospel. You shall not make them earn their own way, make their own bed, find a place to rent, and so on. And he goes down and we'll get to this again. He says, you shall not muzzle the ox or the employee or the minister while he's working. And he says, God's not concerned about oxen, is he? So this is a metaphor. Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? The working ministry. He says, yeah, this was written for our sake. Because the plowman ought to plow in hope. The thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. It's a metaphor. And he says in verse 11, if we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If we taught you about God, and we taught you about Christ, and we taught you how to live, and we taught you how to care for your brethren, is it too much if you all furnish us food, a place to stay? And he says this again to Timothy. He says, let the elders that rule well, not the elders that don't rule well, not the jerks that never should have been put into the ministry to begin with, and some of you on here know what I'm talking about. Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine, those who are teaching about Christ, teaching the word. For the scripture says, and he repeats it, you shall not muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. And then he adds this, the laborer is worthy of his reward. These verses, probably better than any other, show without a doubt that there are principles behind the letter of the law. Who was it? Hank that was talking about that a while ago? None of us, I don't think, now wait a minute, I better back off. I've certainly never used an oxen to pull a plow in the field. Most of us probably don't even have fields. In these scriptures, Paul shows that the law is still in effect. Think about that. That's another reason that Paul has put this in here. The law is still in effect. It's the principle of the law in this case, but the principle of the law of God is still in effect. You can go back to Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and you can read the law. The intent of the original law has another application in this circumstance. Mike James just posted that, right? In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, didn't he cover this? Didn't he say, the law says don't murder, but I'm telling you don't hate your brother? The law says don't commit adultery, but I'm telling you don't look upon another woman with lust. That's the principle behind the law, and it is so important that we understand that. And sometimes, and I'm out on a limb here, probably got a saw between me and the tree, but sometimes the letter doesn't apply as much as the principle. Sometimes the letter applies more than the principle, but there's always the principle, always the metaphor, if you will. So in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he said we must obey the principle of the law and the letter. Another example of this is the law, and this is another one I've repeated 1,000 times, is the law says that we are required to build a battlement or a fence around our roofs. Has anybody ever done that? Built a fence around your roof? Gone up on your roof and built a fence? I'm going to say probably not. The letter of the law says build a fence around your roof. The principle of the law is
Skip, sometimes you got bridges. That's why that they have this side rails so people can't fall when they have like bridges. That's kind of like that purpose when they have like bridges.
Exactly. And the example I was going to use is if you've got a deck out the back of your house that's 5 feet off the ground, put a fence up around it so people don't fall off the deck. That's the principle here of the battlement around the roof. So in this case, the letter's irrelevant unless you live in Phoenix or somewhere where the roofs are flat and maybe people get up on the roof. So Paul's point in quoting the muzzle the ox law is that people who work for you shouldn't be mistreated, nor should you if you work for somebody. Verse 12, if others share the right over you, do we not more? He's talking about he and Barnabas, maybe Silas. So nevertheless, we didn't use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance. We're not going to do anything that's going to slow down the spreading of the gospel, going all the way back to the meat sacrificed to idols. That's included in this right here. We endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Now, chapters 1 and 3, which we went through a few weeks ago, indicate that Peter somehow might have served this congregation. there were some comments in there about Peter. Paul seems to, I don't know any other way to say this, but he seems to resent it a little bit, that they didn't seem to have problems giving money to Peter, but they didn't want to give him any assistance. And I don't know how, that didn't go very deep, I can assure you. But Paul did not exercise his right to be paid because he didn't want to hinder the response of anyone to the gospel. And he knew in this church in particular, it would bother people. Had he been materially recompensed, I don't know why I wrote that, had he been paid for his ministry, some of the people in Corinth might have presumed that he was simply another itinerant educator motivated by profits. Now, folks, I hate to say this, but we got a lot of that going on today. We got a lot of people on TV that, while maybe spreading the gospel or making an attempt to, they have enriched themselves. Some of them live in $30 million homes. Some of them have 4 or 5 jets. I remember one of them saying that, I only have 2 jets and I can't believe you people are begrudging me getting another one. He actually said that. I'm still blown away by it. So to avoid being a stumbling block to anybody, Paul relinquished his right to receive support from those to whom he ministered. Now, he brings up the priests here in verse 13. He says, don't you know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple? I said a while ago, I was talking about the pagan temples, but the same thing occurred with the Levitical priesthood. When someone brought in a bull or a sheep, a goat, whatever, they would take part of it and they would burn it as a burnt offering. Then the priest would take some of it home as, quote, payment, unquote. And the one who offered it could also take some of it home. And that's what he's talking about here in verse 13. He says, don't you know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple? And those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? It's part of the law. 2 Chronicles 31:4. Also, he commanded the people who lived in Jerusalem to give the portion due to the priests and to the Levites, that they might devote themselves to the law of the Lord. So they didn't have to go out and get a job. So all they needed to do was do the work at the temple. And some of them were teachers. Paul applies the command that priests are to be paid to those who work full time preaching the gospel in verse 14. So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. When Jesus Christ sent out the 70 the first time, he told them to take nothing. And he was teaching this principle. He was teaching the principle that if they did the job that God wanted them to do, if they taught the people, they would be taken care of. They didn't need to take food with them. They didn't need to take money with them. They would be taken care of. He said, don't worry about money or food. It'll be provided by the people. Verse 15, he says, but I haven't used any of this. I've not written this stuff that it should be so done to me. I'm not writing this letter so you all will send me a check. For it was better for me to die than that any man should make my glorying void. That I put a stumbling block in front of someone, that because of me they left the faith, and maybe would not be in the resurrection. I don't know that Paul's going that far, but I don't mind saying it. So Paul again in verse 16 states that he had the authority to accept help. He says, "For though I preach the gospel, I don't have to brag about it. I don't have to get the big head. For necessity is laid on me." He says, because my job is to preach the gospel, and I'm in big trouble if I don't preach the gospel. That's why God called me. Paul has been called to preach the gospel. He's a doulos, as I said earlier. Doulos is an important word to remember. It's what we are. We are slaves. Genesis 14:23 concerning Paul's refusal to take let me do that one again. Genesis 14:23 concerning Paul's refusal to take a wage from the brethren. Okay, we can look that up later on. Thank you, Hank.
I'll look it up. Go ahead. Keep
Okay.
going, Skip.
Paul's been called to preach the gospel. He's a doulos. Remember that word. Remember doulos. Remember diakonos, servant. And I never can remember the one that's the under rowers, liturgicus, something like that. That means that we are in the galley, in the bottom of the ship, rowing, and Christ is up on the top, steering the ship. We're doing what we're told, and we're glad to do it, even though we're slaves. But we're willing slaves. We're loving slaves. Verse 17, if I can get it to turn. Verse 17, he says, for if I do this thing willingly. This is a kind of a tough scripture, this verse 17. For if I do this thing willingly, do what thing? Spread the gospel, teach. If I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed to me, it doesn't do me any good if I'm not doing this willingly. Al says, for I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but not of my own will. I'm still entrusted with stewardship. Yeah, thank you. Verse 18, what is my reward? He says over here, if I do it willingly, I have a reward. Now, one thing we know that the reward that Paul is talking about here is not salvation. Can't earn salvation. He can't teach enough to earn salvation. So that's not what he's talking about. And I don't mind admitting that this throws me a little. So if anybody wants to jump in here, feel free to. He's been talking about how ministers, including himself and Barnabas, should be paid. But here he says he has a reward if he doesn't get paid. Anybody got any thoughts on that? I've got some stuff out of a commentary if you don't. Okay, I'm not 100% sure that I agree with the point of expositor's commentary here, but I'm gonna read what they say. It is true that there's a reward or there's pay in preaching, but only if done without pay. Let that soak in. Paul states the alternatives. Is somebody going to say something? I heard a mic.
Yeah. I think it's simpler than that. I think that his reward was the converted people that he's writing to.
Yeah, good.
You know, I mean, this is my work. I mean, look at it. You know, you guys are there because I preached.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's kind of how he kept score, if you will. Well, actually, the next verse pretty much goes on to say about the same thing. It's, in the preaching of the gospel and the results of it.
Yeah, he says, what is my reward then? Well, my reward is when I preach the gospel, I'm giving it to you without charge, that I'm not abusing my power in the gospel. And, I think it bothered him a lot about the attitude of payment that these Corinthian Christians had. And he says, like what Jim said, basically he's saying my reward is you guys. Hello? He says, true that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge. I'm doing this for free. Actually, Paul didn't do it for free. He paid the price. He was stoned. He was shipwrecked. He was beaten. So in effect, he's paying them for spreading the gospel. It's a little backwards, isn't it? Okay. Now he changes gears here in verse 19. Paul's really good about changing the subject with no segues. He's worse than I am. I'm really bad about not using segues, just going from one subject to the next. And a friend of mine once said about me, he said, having a conversation with Skip gives you whiplash. Verse 19, he says, for though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself a doulos, or this could be diakonos. I didn't look it up. It could be either one. I think it's probably doulos. I've made myself a slave to all so that I'll gain more, because I'm not taking any pay. And in verse 20, he says, and this has been so misused. Oh my goodness gracious, over the years, this has been so misused. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. And he's talking about people who still believe that you can earn salvation. That's what he's talking about when he's talking about somebody that's under the law. They're under the burden of the law because they think they can earn salvation and they have to keep the law perfectly. And he says, I deal with them on their own territory. I deal with the Jews on their own territory. And he says to them that are without law, and here he's talking about Gentiles, I think, I deal with them as without law. Same thing, on their term. They didn't, Mike says it is Gentiles. Thank you. He says to them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ. What he's saying there is, you Gentiles did not grow up with the Torah. You didn't grow up memorizing the law. You didn't grow up studying the history of Moses and all of those things. That's what, thanks, Mike. That's what he's talking about. Why? Why does he do this? Why does he become as a Jew? Why does he deal with them on their own terms? Why the Gentiles? Why does he deal with the people who think they can earn salvation by keeping the law? Why does he do all of this? He says, that I might gain them that are without law. He's just using that as one of the examples that he just gave. That's why he does it. He deals with them on their own turf. And isn't that the way you deal with anybody? I can assure you, and I've been going to Bible studies on Wednesday mornings for about 6 years. And they're all Baptists but me. And yet we don't ever have a cross word. And I don't argue with them about everything, but I make my points. And I make them understand that, yes, we observe the law. Yes, we observe the holy days. Yes, we observe the food laws, but we're not doing it in order to be saved. We're doing it because we believe that's what God wants us to do. It's just that simple. He says in verse 22, to the weak I became as weak, to someone new in the faith. I didn't use the big words. He said to the newbies, if you will, I became as a newbie that I might gain the newbies. I made all things to all men that I might by all means save some. I have learned how to deal with anybody. I've dealt with Jews. I've dealt with Gentiles. I've dealt with, what's the word I'm looking for? Legalists. I've dealt with beginners, newbies. Why? That I might by all means save some. It's really pretty simple, but yet verses 20 through 22 have really been abused by people who say, well, this shows that the law's been done away with. No, it doesn't. It shows that Paul can deal with any circumstance that comes in front of him. That's all that he's saying here. Okay. Sorry, I'll get off my high horse. Verse 23. I just skipped it, didn't I? Wow, I did. Here's what verse 23 says. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Everything I do is to promote the gospel of God, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Everything that I do. And he says this right after he got through saying, I deal with who I deal with on their level. In verse 24, and I don't know what happened to this slide. As a matter of fact, I'm going to fix it real quick.
While you're doing that, Skip, there is a technique in leadership called mirror, then lead. The idea there being that you kind of match the temperament and the disposition of the people you are trying to lead. You mirror them, and then once you've mirrored their behavior, you can then lead them. There's a thing called mirror neurons in your brain that says, this person is like me, this person understands me, and then you're more successful at being able to help them, to help suggest new things. So I guess these people read their Bibles.
Yeah. Okay, so verse 23 says, I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may become a partaker of it. He works around differences for the gospel's sake. He doesn't jump on someone and berate them over the difference in their beliefs. And folks, I'm telling you, I've had years and years and years and years and years of experience with this. And I know this is going to sound like bragging, but I've gotten to be pretty good at it. Being able to discuss the Bible with people who don't believe exactly the same way that we believe. And I had Bible study this morning with them. And the leader actually was talking about how he and I disagree a lot. But he said we never fight. We always leave friends. But it makes for a healthy relationship. Anyway, verse 24 says, don't you know that those who run in a race, everybody runs that's running in a race, but only one wins. So you need to run in such a way that you may win. And then don't turn around and do the chicken dance like a football player after he scored a touchdown. It says everybody who competes in the games, and he's doing another athletic metaphor here. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath. But we're going to receive something that's imperishable, that's going to live forever. We are going to live forever. Therefore, he says, I run in such a way, not without aim. He says, I box in such a way as not beating the air. I'm not wasting my breath and just, swinging at nothing, but I discipline my body and I make it my slave. That's probably doulos. Make it my slave so that, why does he discipline his body? So that after I have preached to others, I won't be disqualified. It's maybe a little scary that Paul, speaking of the work that he has freely given on behalf of the Corinthians, that at the end he could find himself rejected by God. That's a stern warning for all of us that we can't give up. We must continue to fight, and we must fight till the day we die. That's all I've got. Oh, verse 26. No, I already did that. Sorry. Thoughts, comments, corrections? Yeah, he who overcometh. Allison.
Yeah.
Yes, Skip. Yeah, thank you for the message today. It's kind of really helped me because the manager was giving bonuses out to all of his employees, and he's probably doing it because of this time of year, but he called it a love gift. So I kind of thought that was kind of nice.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing wrong at all with taking a bonus this time of the year. I know some people have these attitudes about Christmas and all of that, but you still have to feed your family.
Yeah, they got to do that. They're doing it from the heart, and it's like kind of, anyway.
We used to give a month's salary. No chicken dances here. We used to give a month's salary out to all of our employees on December the 24th, and that's when I was not the CEO. And the first thing I did, y'all, I hope you get a kick out. I'm going to shut the recording off because I don't want everybody to hear this.